Imagine waking up to frequent power outages, not knowing if you'll have electricity to cook breakfast or run your business. Imagine watching your hard-earned money lose its value, with a single dollar worth more than 13 times the local currency. Sounds like a nightmare, right? But for the people of Cuba, this is their harsh reality today. Cuba, once a thriving island of promise, has found itself trapped in a crisis that's decades in the making. From an economy fueled by free Soviet oil to relying on Venezuelan oil, and now, a collapse in both, Cuba is fighting for survival. But the biggest blow? The country is under severe sanctions, strangling any hope of international relief. In this video, we'll dive into Cuba's struggling economy, the currency crisis, and the dramatic shift toward dollarization. You'll discover how billions of dollars are pouring into the country, but not in the way you think. Stay tuned, because the story of Cuba's battle to survive is not just about money. It's about the future of an entire nation. Let's break it down. USA-Cuba relations and economic struggles. Cuba's economic troubles can be traced back to the Cold War era, when the island nation was deeply aligned with the Soviet Union. As fellow communist allies, the Soviets provided Cuba with large amounts of free oil, allowing the country to build its energy infrastructure around oil-fired power plants. At the time, this made perfect sense. Cuba had a guaranteed supply of fuel at no cost, so it didn't have to worry about energy expenses. But everything changed when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, almost overnight. Cuba lost its main economic lifeline, plunging the country into a deep financial crisis. The government was forced to ration electricity, factories shut down, and daily life became a struggle for many Cubans. For a while, Venezuela stepped in as Cuba's new benefactor. Under an agreement between Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez, Venezuela provided Cuba with cheap oil in exchange for thousands of Cuban doctors and medical personnel. This partnership helped stabilize Cuba's economy, at least temporarily. However, history repeated itself. In recent years, Venezuela fell into its own economic disaster with hyperinflation, political instability, and a crumbling oil industry. As a result, the flow of cheap oil to Cuba slowed dramatically, leaving the island once again struggling to generate enough electricity. To make matters worse, Cuba has been under U.S. sanctions since the 1960s. Before Fidel Castro's revolution, the United States was Cuba's largest trading partner. But after the revolution, relations soured, and the U.S. imposed a strict embargo. This meant Cuba could no longer export goods to the U.S. or import essential supplies, forcing it to rely on allies like the Soviet Union and Venezuela. There was a brief glimmer of hope in early 2025 when President Joe Biden removed Cuba from the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism. This move suggested that relations between the two countries might improve, and some even speculated that certain economic sanctions could be lifted. However, just a week later, after taking office, President Donald Trump reinstated Cuba on the terrorism list, immediately crushing those hopes. With Cuba once again labeled a state sponsor of terrorism, any possibility of U.S. investment, trade, or economic relief was effectively shut down. The peso crisis and rising dollarization. While energy shortages and sanctions have crippled Cuba's economy, another major crisis has been unfolding: the collapse of the Cuban peso. For years, the Cuban government artificially controlled the peso's exchange rate, maintaining an official rate of 24 pesos per U.S. dollar. However, this rate doesn't reflect the actual value of the currency. In reality, on the black market, the peso has plummeted to over 325 pesos per U.S. dollar, a staggering decline. This collapse has led to a widespread loss of confidence in the peso. Imagine you're a Cuban who receives money from a relative in the United States. If you exchange $100 at the official rate, you get 2,400 pesos. But if you exchange it on the black market, you get 32,500 pesos, over 13 times more money. With such a massive gap between the official and black market exchange rates, it's no surprise that most people refuse to use the official system. Instead, they hoard U.S. dollars or trade them in secret. This has created a phenomenon known as dollarization, where people prefer to use US dollars over their own currency. The Cuban government has tried to control this situation, but with rising inflation and a struggling economy, the peso continues to lose value. Everyday goods are becoming more expensive, and many Cubans find themselves unable to afford basic necessities. The role of remittances in Cuba's economy. Despite all these challenges, one thing keeps the Cuban economy afloat: remittances. Remittances are money sent by Cubans living abroad, mainly in the United States, back to their families in Cuba. Over the past 2 decades, the number of Cuban migrants in the U.S. has skyrocketed. In 2000, about 873,000 Cubans were legally living in the U.S. By 2023, that number had more than doubled to 1.8 million. Out of those, over 878,000 regularly send money back to Cuba every month. The impact of these remittances is huge. In 2023 alone, the official amount of money transferred from the U.S. to Cuba was around $2.5 billion. However, the true figure, including money sent through unofficial channels, was likely closer to $5 billion. Since most of this money arrives in U.S. dollars, it further increases the demand for dollars inside Cuba. Many Cubans rely on this money to survive, especially as inflation and the peso's devaluation make local wages nearly worthless. With rising economic hardship, more and more Cubans are risking dangerous journeys to the U.S., hoping to find work and send money home. This cycle of migration and remittances has become a crucial survival mechanism for many Cuban families. Partial dollarization in Cuba. In response to the peso's collapse and the growing reliance on U.S. dollars, the Cuban government recently took an unexpected step, allowing certain businesses to accept dollars legally. This partial dollarization started in 2024 and includes industries related to tourism, airports, clinics, hospitals, opticians, and high-end Cuban cigar retailers. The government has now approved supermarkets to accept dollars, marking the first time in nearly 20 years that grocery stores in Cuba can legally take U.S. currency. The goal is to capture some of the remittance money flowing into the country and use it to fund social programs, like free healthcare and subsidized food. However, this policy also highlights growing inequality. Those with access to U.S. dollars can afford better goods and services, while those relying on pesos struggle to keep up. Summary and conclusions. Cuba's economy is in severe crisis, facing critical challenges that continue to push the country deeper into financial turmoil. With persistent energy shortages, businesses and households struggle with frequent blackouts, making daily life and economic growth nearly impossible. The reinstatement of U.S. sanctions has crushed any hopes of trade improvements, leaving Cuba isolated at a time when it desperately needs international support. The Cuban peso has collapsed, with the black market exchange rate soaring past 325 pesos per U.S. dollar, rendering the local currency nearly useless. Meanwhile, billions of U.S. dollars flow into Cuba each year through remittances from Cubans abroad, leading to a surge in dollarization. Recognizing this reality, the government has partially legalized the use of U.S. dollars, allowing businesses like supermarkets, airports, and medical facilities to accept foreign currency for the first time in decades. Despite these policy shifts, Cuba still faces an uphill battle. The government is working with China on renewable energy projects, but those solutions remain far off. Without a game-changing shift, whether through securing affordable energy or improving foreign relations, the economic outlook remains bleak. Thanks for watching today's video. If you found this analysis helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more updates. See you in the next one.